Ah, treaties. What a way to be peaceful, or not. Treaties are normally signed by countries to get rid of the ongoing disputes that's happening within them, but within the case of two specific wars that are happening right now in the globe, yeah, that's not going to happen. But even if treaties have been signed, there were actually times when someone thought, hey, this treaty is not doing our country any good. Let's abolish this treaty and let's go to war with whoever we signed this with. And that's why I'm making this video, so that we could stay away from things like the Treaty of Versailles. This bad boy was signed on the 28th of June 1919 in the Palace of Versailles, hence the Treaty of Versailles, because it wouldn't be named that way if it was signed somewhere else. This agreement was the symbol that World War I was finally over, and it was primarily haggled by the Allied powers, which were the United States, France, and the UK, and the three of them basically said, hey, we don't want war. In fact, one other country participated in this, and you will not expect who it was. It was Italy who was one of the people that pushed for the treaty oversight to happen, but his influence was less important compared to the other three countries because, come on, we know who you're going to turn your back against when World War II starts. Now, the Treaty of Versailles actually aimed to set the terms for peace and to make sure that Germany would be held responsible for what they did in the war. And yeah, that did not end well. One of the most controversial aspects of the treaty was Article 231. Known as the War Guilt Clause, which placed full responsibility for the war on Germany and its allies. This gave Germany heavy sanctions like 132 billion gold marks, or about $33 billion at that time, which was a big number if you ask me. I mean, even $1 billion today is already huge. What more during the early 1900s, right? This meant that Germany had to pay basically the emotional plus legal plus structural damages that happened when the war was still happening. Territorial-wise, the treaty was so anti-German, like they legit lost a lot of places. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, Eupen and Malmedy were given to Belgium, and northern Schleswig was handed back to Denmark. The Saar Basin was now under the control of France, and apart from that, Germany was still required to give some land and some territories to Lithuania and the Czech Republic, which was Czechoslovakia then. Of course, Germany was like, okay, we understand. We wanted to get this anyway when the war was going on our side, but now that it's not, okay, sure, go ahead, take it back. But then the military restrictions came in, where it basically told the Germans to reduce its size and have a 100,000 troop limit. The forced enlistment was removed as well, and the country was actually banned from having tanks, planes, and even submarines. The Navy was limited to 6 battleships, cruisers, 12 destroyers, and a little bit of 12 torpedo boats, with no submarines allowed. Okay, if you are going to be the country that needs to prepare itself for war, this is downright unacceptable. But within the perspective of the Allied powers, this is justifiable considering what Germany did during World War I. They did not only lose territories close to them, they also lost some colonies. Germany had colonies in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, and all of them were confiscated and given to the Allied powers. Okay, now I'm slowly realizing that the Allied powers are just slowly becoming power-hungry, and this is just their way of becoming a superpower in the future. With all of that being prohibited and confiscated from Germany, they had a hard time rebuilding the economy. They got hyperinflation. Although not worse than what Zimbabwe had, where you can be a quadrillionaire and still be poor. Germany was publicly and globally humiliated with these sanctions, and with these reparations that they had to pay, and all these things combined taught the German how to hate the Americans and basically the Allied powers. The Weimar Republic, which was the government of the Germans back then, had oppositions from both left and right that they did not know who to fight first or who to defend against first. November criminals was a term used by the German nationalists to describe the politicians who signed the treaty, and they were actually blamed for the country's misfortunes and what they are undergoing or experiencing during that time. When the citizens are mad, they know who to turn to. The citizens as well. And yeah, let's just say that one man that was rejected from art school in Austria got the power to be the Chancellor of Germany so that they could regain their status, and let's hide him under the name Adolf Hitler. And that was the start of something really bad. France saw the treaty as a way to cripple Germany against other countries forever. The US did not actually ratify the Treaty of Versailles because the League of Nations are saying hello. Basically, Germany saw the Treaty of Versailles as a trap and a ploy by the Allied powers to cripple their economy, their military, and their country until the end of time. And look what we have now. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed on the 2nd of February 1848, which officially ended the Mexican-American War. It was a war that made Americans look like the bad guys, which they were in this scenario because they wanted to manifest destiny. Just a little historical lesson here. Manifest destiny is the belief that Americans were meant to expand their land. What in the world? Anyway, the war itself was a product of escalating tensions over territorial disputes already, wherein the United States under President James K. Polk was very eager to expand westward, as I said earlier, like the Manifest Destiny, and following the annexation of Texas in 1845, a move that Mexico never recognized as legit, the US actually wanted more domain expansion. James K. Polk legitimately believed on the Manifest Destiny idea, because he was willing to use military force to achieve this goal. Gojo Satoru never did that with his domain expansion, but I get Polk's superstition. There were killings that began in April of 1846, when American and Mexican forces clashed along the Rio Grande. If you played Red Dead Redemption 1, you'll probably saw this happen. And by 1847, American troops under the command of General Winfield Scott got Mexico City. When a capital of a country gets taken by an opposing country, it always means something will be negotiated afterwards, like in this case. The Mexican officials were forced to negotiate peace because America's already got the capital. What more do they need to get to declare the victory? The US sent out the diplomat Nicholas Trist to handle the blah 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 and the babble-rabble-rabble with the Mexicans. But the thing is, even when Trist was called back by Polk in late 1847, he stayed in Mexico and managed to negotiate the terms of the treaty, believing that if he leaves, it would jeopardize the negotiation itself, that the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo required Mexico to give up a 55% of its territory to the United States, which, if you know how to count 55%, is more than half the country. The negotiation had US wanting more than half of Mexico. Mexico back then included California, Nevada, Utah, a lot of parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and some parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Well, of course the US tried to play like the good Samaritan that they are, even if they just went into a war with the country that they're trying to negotiate these territorial disputes with. They agreed to pay Mexico $15 million and assumed about $3.25 million in debt owed by Mexico to American citizens. If you think about that, that was pure BS, except that the Mexicans had to accept it because they didn't have any leverage. The treaty also established the Rio Grande as the border between Texas and Mexico, where Trump built this gigantic wall. The treaty was updated by the US Senate on the 10th of March 1848 and by the Mexican government on the 30th of May the same year. It was proclaimed on the 4th of July 1848. The treaty ended war, yes, but not the fueled anger of the Mexicans towards the Americans. Mexicans that were living in the places and states that used to be Mexico's territory were granted rights by the treaty to have property and even offered them the choice to relocate within Mexico's new boundaries or stay there to become a US citizen. And US being the US. These promises were just left to be promises. I mean, they already promised. What more do the Mexicans want? They got the promise. The US actually never said that they would fulfill that promise. And because of this, many Mexicans who chose to stay there that were promised full American citizenship and rights got into a lot of legal battles. They also faced discrimination. They had a loss of land and their rights were frequently violated, so it was like Christopher Columbus's men were pillaging the Native Americans again. Having these new territories, of course, entailed a lot of downsides for the United States. There were debates if they would permit slavery in these states, because they didn't initially know what to do because they didn't live there, and Mexico's law was the one running those lands. Debates turned into fights, the fights turned to riots, and the riots turned into, yes,
it's a civil war.
But going south of the United States, Mexico saw the treaty as a big slap to their faces. Losing more than half of its territory was the perfect reason for Mexicans to be mad at the gringos. Camp David Accords. David Accords was a landmark agreement between Egypt and the other country that is currently at war right now, Israel, and it was led by former US President Jimmy Carter. These accords were the result of 12 days of intense negotiations at Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland. The main characters in these negotiations were the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, and US former President Jimmy Carter as a mediator, or the person that would stand between these countries. You know, because US likes to meddle in everyone's business, because they're just a complete dominant superpower all across the globe. Egypt and Israel have a bad military experience with each other, with Egypt being defeated by Israel many times, especially during the Six-Day War in 1967. So with that, Egypt was like, I want to get the Sinai Peninsula back so that we can improve our economy. And the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat went to Jerusalem in November of 1977, where he visited the Israeli assembly and stated that he wanted some form of peace and all of that. You're probably too young to still know about this, or maybe you don't read too much of history, but Sadat's visit to Jerusalem was really historical because it was like Kim Jong-un stepping over the demilitarized zone crossing to South Korea. Even with the huge suspicions between Egypt and Israel, they still went on with the negotiations, and the Camp David summit began on the 5th of September 1978. What Jimmy Carter did as the representative of the meddling country was that he had separate meetings with both the Egyptian and the Israeli president so that he can, objectively, judge the situation and offer the negotiation terms for both of these countries. Imagine Jimmy Carter just doing crossovers between cabins so that both countries get enough attention from him. Haha. And it proved to be the case because both of the countries had different negotiating styles. Sadat's focus was on broad political goals, and Begin's approach was very detailed and legalistic. And after a while of Jimmy Carter having to tend both countries, they made two framework agreements. The first was a framework for peace in the Middle East, and it talked about a lot of more general issues like the Palestinian territories, which we can see right now, is on the verge of disappearing. Look it up on Google Maps. It's no longer there. I don't know why, it just isn't. The framework for the peace in the Middle East mostly focused on Palestine wants to have a self-governing authority in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Yeah, it's getting worse every time I get deeper into this research because of so much foreshadowing. The second framework was a framework for the conclusion of a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Well, from the title itself, it just specifically talks about how Egypt and Israel would be peaceful to each other without having to offend anyone anywhere in any way possible. This included Israel's complete withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula. So it's Egypt again, because it's been occupied by the Israelis since the Six-Day War. In exchange, Israel wanted a full diplomatic recognition by Egypt and the normalization of relations between the two countries. What does that mean? I don't know. You tell me. But what I can tell you is that it just means Israel's ships. Doesn't matter if it's military cargo or cruise, it would have a free passage through the Suez Canal and the Straits of Tiran. I don't know why they want free passage there, when the Suez Canal is plagued with so many pirates, but let them do their thing. Again, this idea is very good, but the Accords faced a lot of opposition, particularly from other Arab nations. The Arab League actually condemned Sadat's actions as betrayal, leading to Egypt's suspension from the organization from 1979 to 1989. And even with the international recognitions, including a Nobel Prize for Sadat in 1978 for that matter. So that decision to be peaceful with his ops basically just gave him a big target mark on his back, where the bullseye was bigger than the entire target. He was the bullseye, and with a bullseye that's really easy to hit, like him, it would not be that hard to kill him. Which happened on the 6th of October 1981, when Muslim extremists had a military parade in Cairo. The Camp David Accords talked about a lot of things about the relations of the Palestinian territories with Israel, and I don't know what to do at this point. Maybe let's just pretend the Camp David Accords did not exist in the first place and watch the war happen in Gaza. Treaty of New Echota. The Treaty of New Echota was what I like to call a facade to something really bad. What happened in New Echota can be traced back to the early 19th century, when the US government was being pressured by the white people to remove the native Indians in the southeastern United States because they wanted to exploit that land. The former president Andrew Jackson was a very strong advocate of removing the Indians from these places, and that's why he signed the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which was the legal way of kicking out these settlers. He kicked them out, and then they wanted to relocate these tribes to the west of the Mississippi River. And even when the Cherokee Nation was completely against this, Cherokee leaders like Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot took it as it is and just accepted the fact that they were going to get kicked out because the president was a big supporter of these white people. Why don't we just negotiate a treaty so that it would hurt less when we get kicked out, says a Cherokee leader, hoping that they would have the best possible terms for their people when they proposed negotiating a treaty. Some people believed that the treaty would be a good idea, and this faction was representing less than 5% of the Cherokee population back then, and it was known as the Treaty Party. And the majority of the Cherokee was led by Principal Chief John Ross, opposed the idea of any treaty because they wanted to remain on the lands that they were in. But it still happened when the negotiations between the Treaty Party and US government representatives signed the Treaty of the New Echota. The treaty stated that the Cherokee would give all of their lands, as in 100% of their lands in the east of Mississippi River, in exchange for $5 million, relocation assistance, and land in the Midwest, also known as Oklahoma today. The interesting thing about this is the treaty was signed by people who did not have the legal authority to represent the entire Cherokee Nation, also known as lawyers. That's why the treaty was controversial, and the Cherokee people basically did not consider it as legit. When the rest of the Cherokee Nation heard about it, they were on fire. Principal Chief John Ross and the National Council actually opposed the idea of the treaty as well, and even condemned it, saying that it was a fraud and did not reflect the majority of the decision of the Cherokee people, because again, the Treaty Party only had 5% of the population of the Cherokee people back in the States during that time. So what the rest of the Cherokee population did was they organized a petition drive, having nearly 15,000 signatures representing almost the entire adult Cherokee population, and to urge the U.S. Senate to reject the treaty. But even with the amount of petitions and signatures that they got, the U.S. Senate still accepted the Treaty of New Echota by a single vote on the 18th of May, 1836. President Andrew Jackson signed it into law on the 23rd of May, giving a 2-year deadline for the Cherokee to get out of there. When the deadline for removal got closer, many Cherokees still remained hopeful that the treaty would be adjusted and reconsidered. But the federal government did not budge on the decision they made 2 years prior to this removal by 1838, with only about 2,000 Cherokees relocating on their own. President Martin Van Buren ordered General Winfield Scott to force them out. General Scott had a force of 7,000 soldiers behind him to gather all the Cherokees in land. They didn't care about what the Cherokee would feel because they would oftentimes point bayonets at them from their homes, and then they would collect them all into stockades. They forced the Cherokee to march to the Indian Territory, and this is what was known as the Trail of Tears. This began in the fall of 1838, and about 16,000 Cherokee walked westward, going to Oklahoma. They had to travel over 1,000 miles under harsh conditions, and the march got so many people sick, hungry, and thirsty. The result of this was about a quarter of the entire population of the Cherokee died because of the forced relocation. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Signed on the 18th of October, 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was meant to end the War of the Austrian Succession, which happened in Europe in the mid-1700s. The war began because Charles VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, died in 1740, and it led to a power struggle in who would take over the throne. Is it going to be Charles VI's daughter, Maria Theresa, or someone else? The negotiations for the treaty were spearheaded by Britain and France, with other European powers like Austria, the Dutch Republic, Spain, and Prussia being involved. The initial peace talks happened in Breda, a city in the Dutch Republic, in 1746, but it wasn't until 1748 that the final agreement was reached in Aix-la-Chapelle, which is now Aachen, Germany. I have to say, that was a really long negotiation. One of the agreements that was inside the treaty was that the territories that were conquered during the war would be returned to their respective countries. For example, France returned the Austria-Netherlands to Austria, and Britain returned the fortress of Louisbourg in North America to France. Which actually begs the question, how in the world did they find a time to conquer North America while everything in France was just going haywire? Apart from that, Madras in India was returned to Britain by France, which made a little bit of sense because of the British East India Company. What everyone actually wanted to do was to stay the same with the territories as if nothing happened, as if no war just ensued. Well, a lot of these countries were not satisfied with the agreements that they had to make because Europe, during those times, revolved around invading other territories and the plague. The treaty also addressed so many claims in succession rights that it confirmed Maria Theresa as the legit ruler of Austria. But this did not go well to other European powers who wanted to have what Maria Theresa had, which was the Habsburg territories. So basically what happened right here in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was that a lot of the countries felt that the treaty failed to secure the interests of everyone in an appropriate manner. I mean, they tried to be peaceful, but in the end, it just failed when the 7 Years' War happened in 1756, just 8 years after signing the treaty. So yeah, they tried. But as James Ingram's song goes, I did my best, but I guess my best wasn't good enough, 'cause here we are back where we were before. Yeah. I am not doing that again. Treaty of Portsmouth. This was the treaty that declared the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 as finished. This war actually began because both Russia and Japan's goals in Northeast Asia, like controlling China and Korea, were the same. And neither one was willing to give up one territory that they wanted to invade, so here they are invading each other. This was one of the battles where Japan had to be sneaky, like their surprise attack on the Russian fleet at Port Arthur and the Battle of Tsushima, where Japan destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet. The negotiations for peace took place in Portsmouth in New Hampshire, again, under the very great meddler US presidents. This time it's Theodore Roosevelt and not Jimmy Carter. Roosevelt's involvement was actually because he was concerned that the longer the fight in the Far East will have the worst effect on the US being interested in what China will be in the following years. That's why they wanted both of these countries to stop fighting, so that they can have their own way on their own interest. I never knew that being such a nosy official would give you a Nobel Peace Prize because Roosevelt just won one in 1906 because of this. Japan was represented by Foreign Minister Komuro Jutaro and Ambassador Takahiro Koguro. Russia was represented by Sergei Witte and Roman Rosen. The series of blah 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 began at the 9th of August 1905, and the representatives of each country met every day at the Portsmouth Mayville shipyard in Kittery, Maine. "What do you want?" says Russia. "Oh, we're gonna play that game? Okay. Let me just give you my list. I want China, I want Korea, I want the railway in China, I want money, and also the island of Sakhalin. Would you be able to give me those things?" says Japan, oblivious of what was about to happen, but still, they got the spirit. Russia just answered them all with a blatant big no, and Tsar Nicholas II told his representatives not to agree to any requests or demands about territories. One country wants something, one country doesn't want to give it to them. "If we are going to continue this kind of talk, no progress will happen," says Teddy Roosevelt, because he is getting tired of listening to this since he thought listening and being a comforting soldier to those two countries would be an easy task. So Teddy Roosevelt stood up and said, "Okay, how about this? Russia would divide Sakhalin Island with Japan so that they don't have to give Japan money anymore." They agreed to what Teddy Roosevelt said, and in the end, the Treaty of Portsmouth had a lot of compromises. Japan had control over Korea and the southern half of Sakhalin Island. Then Russia gave its territory in southern China, including Port Arthur, and then transferred the control of the Southern Chinese Railway to Japan. In exchange, Japan agreed to drop its demand for money. Japan was happy for the most part, but Russia wasn't. The losses that Russia experienced during the war between these two countries, combined with economic problems and the people wanting a big change, and these are the driving points for the Bolshevik Revolution to happen. Strikes, uprisings, even demands for political reform forced Tsar Nicholas II to implement limited constitutional changes. So yeah, bombs away, I guess.